Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be giving a presentation on criminal defense-based forensic social work, and I wanted to take the time for everybody, participants included, to introduce themselves and share a little bit about how or why you got into this type of work. I am Maren Willins. I live in Colorado and have been a practicing forensic social worker for about 20 plus years now. I started way back when in graduate school in St. Louis when I knew I was very interested in working with individuals with severe mental health issues. So I was doing my internship practicum at the state hospital there. When I moved to Colorado, I was fortunate enough to find an internship through the public defender's office when it was just myself and one other social worker. I worked at the PD's office for about 5 years, took a little break away from work to have a family, and got back into the alternate defense counsel in Colorado. Working with juvenile life without parole clients is how it started, and it really took off from there. This led into me doing a lot more research as I was doing the one-on-one work and the teamwork, and seeing what was out there in terms of research and written work for criminal defense-based social work. And I found there was no book. So with Molly as a contributing author and many others, we wrote the book on criminal defense-based forensic social work, which has enabled me to teach and train across the country, which I love to do. So I will stop talking, and I'm curious why others got into this work and how.
My name is Simi Baer, and I have been a poverty lawyer for over 40 years. I went to a law school in Washington, D.C. that specialized in poverty law, which was called Antioch School of Law, that's morphed into the University of the District of Columbia. And I got a poverty law fellowship there that placed me out in Washington State, and that's how I ended up in Washington State. I was at the public defender, one of the public defender agencies called the Defender Association for 20 years, up until 2005. And I was supervisor of the juvenile division beginning in 1989. And when I started as the supervisor, one thing I realized was we needed a full-time social worker. The agency had a full social worker division, but no one was designated as the juvenile division social worker. So I got a Jesuit volunteer corps person who I utilized as a social worker to be able to show the county how important it was to have a full-time social worker in the juvenile division, which I was able to establish. And then each of the other agencies was able to get a full-time juvenile social worker also, and that was in about 1990 and has remained that way. I also created and wrote a grant for a program called Team Child. There's an office, or was an office, in Yakima, Spokane, Pierce County, King County. I left in 2005 to go to Chicago to work in the Children and Family Justice Center at Northwestern Law School, where I ran the Juvenile Justice Clinic. Went to Colorado in 2011 to take care of my mother who had Alzheimer's, and did work for ADC and did the juvenile life without parole cases. I left Colorado in 2014 to come back to the Northwest, where I worked at another public defender agency and worked with social workers in the community there. And now I'm in Tucson, where I have retired, but am going to seek out the law school juvenile and family law clinics to do some volunteer work for them.
Okay, I will go next. My name is Molly Hennessey. I have been in the field for about 10 years now. I got my start an interest in working with juveniles involved with the legal system while I was in college. I volunteered at the King County Juvenile Detention Facility and worked in the school. I was really taken with the youth I got to work with through tutoring and reading their writing assignments. And so when I went on to get my master's in social work, I really wanted to focus on working with youth. And I learned about mitigation and defense-based social work while I was in grad school through a professor, Jacoba Rock. She gave me my first job in Colorado, which was working on their equivalent of decline and auto decline cases, as well as with adults who are serving life without parole for juvenile sentences. So I worked there until 2017, and I moved back home to Seattle. And I have been working at the King County Department of Public Defense at the ACA division for 7 years now. I do our juvenile cases, and I also work with adults and young adults charged with felonies.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to share how and why they got into this work?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I can go next. So my name is Paula Herrera, and I first got into this work back, I want to say about 3 years ago, but I had my start in social work about 4 years ago, and my start was a little different. I had attended Heritage University, and through there, I had connected with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and I was working in the field assisting individuals regain custody of their children. And it was through that work that I had seen the need that there was for our children to access services as well as their parents. And this kind of fell into my lap by accident as well. I had looked into the Washington State Office of Public Defense and contracting with them. And there was a grant initiative for this, and I went ahead and I joined the team. And it was through that I realized I had a huge passion for working with adolescents.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Connie Lopez. I graduated with a criminal justice degree, and I started working with adults for a few years. And then when I moved to Tri-Cities, I started working with the juveniles through a program through the school district at the juvenile detention. And so that gave me kind of an understanding of how the systems works and things like that. So when I had the opportunity to work for the public defense, I took the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this, I'm going to move our faces. What do we do exactly? I do find that a lot of people think we do these things, which in some traditional sense, maybe. I know I feel like this at any given point in the week, but basically a criminal defense-based forensic social worker. Can you do the next slide, please? Simply put, meets a client's legal needs and social work needs. It's based on holistic defense, working together as a team with the client as a member, most important member of that team, all towards getting the best legal outcome. Next slide, please. Simi, was there something you wanted to read there or not yet?
Sure. I just wanted to read very quickly a paragraph from one of my favorite summations from a case from 1924, because we think that this whole idea of holistic representation and using social work just came about with the cases of Roper, and just really starting in 2005 that we're focusing on adolescent brain development. And it really was recognized back in 1924 in a case called Leopold and Loeb, where Clarence Darrow represented these two teenagers who killed another young boy just to see if they could commit the perfect crime. And his whole point in his closing argument, which lasted about 18 hours, was to convince the judge that because of their youth, they shouldn't get the death penalty. And he said so many wonderful things in his closing that I've used throughout my career in court, in all my cases, because I so believe that the law doesn't move people or judges, but facts do. and our social worker fact collectors. They help us go behind the charged crime and really figure out our client's story of innocence or reduced culpability or whatever it is we want to convince the judge to do. So I just want to read one of my favorite paragraphs that I just think explains so much. It says, "That is not all there is about it. Youth is hard enough. The only good thing about youth is that it has no thought and no care, and how blindly we can do things when we are young. Where is the man who has not been guilty of delinquencies in youth? Let us be honest with ourselves. Let us look into our own hearts. How many men are there today, lawyers and congressmen and judges, and even state's attorneys, who have not been guilty of some mad act in youth? And if they did not get caught or the consequences were trivial, it was their good fortune. We might as well be honest with ourselves, Your Honor. Before I would tie a noose around the neck of a boy, I would try to call back into my mind the emotions of youth. I would try to remember what the world looked like to me when I was a child. I would try to remember how strong were these instinctive, persistent emotions that moved my life. I would try to remember how weak and inefficient was youth in the presence of the surging, controlling feelings of the child. One that honestly remembers and asks himself the question and tries to unlock the door that he thinks is closed and calls back the boy can understand the boy. And that's what we're trying to get prosecutors, judges, probation officers, all the people involved in our cases to do is call back the child, to look into their own souls and hearts and realize that we are all more than our worst acts.
Thank you, Simi. And
Sure.
that gets into how do we do that? I know we're all doing this already, but as a review, what are the skills of a forensic social worker? Rapport building, as you know, is paramount, because if we can't have a professional, appropriate connection with the child, and I try to say child because I know some people have different feelings about saying teen, adolescent, kiddo. I've heard them all, and I've heard lots of opinions about that. So I'll try to do child. Forgive me if I don't stick to that, but this is who we're working with. If I can't connect and if they don't feel comfortable with me, I can't get to know them and help in sort of assessing what's going on, seeing how I can be emotionally supportive to them, possibly their family when appropriate, advocating for what's best legally and possibly for the child when they're either at home or in the community or in a detention center. A lot of resource identification, oftentimes psychoeducation, because there's mental health issues that are maybe coming up or that have been there that haven't been clearly defined either to our child client or to the family, or honestly to some of the professionals working with our client. Clinical interviewing is almost always a part of my everyday work. Occasionally, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of this later, but there's crisis intervention. Really helping our client with some skill building. There's always a goal of helping them advocate for themselves, figure out, sometimes it's day-to-day life skills. That's a huge part of what we do. Occasionally, I don't know if you ladies are, but occasionally I'm called to testify. Research is almost always a part of my mitigation, whether it be written or oral. Kind of per what Simi said earlier, if I can't back it up with the research and the facts, my thoughts, they do now, but it's taken 20 years. My thoughts alone don't always count for much if I can't back it up with the end. And I put DEVO in there because I know that's a goal of many, and that's defense initiated victim outreach. I know a lot of that happened with some of the jail WAP clients, and that's super case by case basis and not always appropriate. But I know for some counties and some forensic work, that is the goal. But I think for us, starting with rapport building and really ending with mitigation is the best sort of flow of the skills that we use to help our clients get their best legal outcome and be left in a better spot than when we first met them. Can I have the next slide, please? So what does that look like? What are our work product? I know each sort of attorney team sometimes varies on this, but I always take some form of visit notes, whether that be very detailed. As I tell my clients, the first 2 times I meet with them, I'm really trying to keep eye contact, but I also want to take a lot of notes because I'm getting to know them. And sometimes I'll break that up by theme or chronologically, sort of what works best for you. Records review, Molly's really going to get into this in a bit for Washington specific, but how to attain those records and piece them apart. Court reports are always a big part. And I say sometimes it just goes to my attorney and the client as an effective tool. Sometimes it goes on to the DA and sometimes it goes on to the judge. And that's really up to the legal team to decide with the attorney as the lead on that. But I do mitigation and sentencing reports. Certainly for some of our more involved clients, a biopsychosocial report might be appropriate. And I almost always mention to my clients, if I'm not doing that, I like to recognize that, if something's a shorter report, I do that for the purposes of it being digestible by our audience. Not that their whole life story isn't important, but I want to keep in mind the overall goal. So I almost feel guilty about that sometimes, not writing everything, but it's not always the best choice. Memos for updates to our attorneys, and I'll give you examples of genograms, eco maps, and timelines in the next couple slides, and then I'm going to move us to see what else I wrote here. Is it testimony at the end? I can't see.
Yes.
Okay, testimony at the end would certainly be our work product because it goes into the court record. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of an eco map. I didn't actually write this one, but I think it can be at minimum, a really effective tool with our child clients or our clients, even if it doesn't go beyond them, to just sort of have a working. I love drawing things out on paper with my clients, especially the younger ones, because it can be so hard to have that eye contact. And I'm asking them to think about things that are uncomfortable or that maybe they haven't really pieced apart before. And I'd like these because you can really show the positive and negative influence and how complicated relationships can be and events in your life. And you can really go all out on this. I don't often include these in my reports, but it can be a really effective tool. Do you ladies use these at all?
I don't, but I think that's a good tool to use so that they can see it in front of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have in the past, yes.
Okay. And I don't know if anybody's seen Inside Out 1 and 2, but basically what they conceptualize in that movie of cartoons, I think, is one, amazing because children and their caregivers are seeing this, and 2 is basically an eco map and how it can change and how it can get built up and how things fall. And I just find it to be really powerful. Next slide, please. Oh, this one I'm very proud of. I did make this one. I remember this was with, at the time, he was only about 16-year-old male client of mine who he himself did not have a criminal history. And his first trouble with the law was pretty serious crimes he was being charged with. And he was facing some serious time, possibly in the adult system. And we were obviously working towards the juvenile system. As I was getting to know him, and as many of the teenage boys that I either know through my son's friends or through work, talking one-on-one about hard things is really difficult and a lot for me as a professional to ask of my client. As I was getting to talk with him and meet with him, I noticed a lot of police contact. outside of himself, whether it be with mom, grandma, dad, grandpa. So as we were discovering this, and times that the police were just called to the neighborhood, called to the home, was a lot. And I was listing it out, sort of writing it out. And I had the idea of making a timeline with this because he was so affected by it really since he was born. His mom was in jail shortly after his birth. His grandma was his main caregiver. Dad was in and out. And then mom and grandpa went back later in his life. So while he didn't, quote unquote, have a criminal history, the contact with the police and the law and the criminal justice system, more negative than anything, really affected and impacted sort of the family culture, how he was doing, how he was going to try to move forward. So this, I do think the attorney did blow this up to just sort of visualize for everybody how, yeah, this is his first offense, which is very important, but what that means in his culture of family. So that was a good one. Next slide, please.
And I think that's also really helpful to plan transition services for clients when they're coming out of the juvenile institutions. Because when you have a family like that, although it may be the client's first contact with the criminal justice system, their likelihood to reoffend, if they go right back into that family without appropriate, developmentally appropriate services and support, then you can predict the outcome. And I think it's important to show judges that it's not the client, the child, that is the one that's having all the difficulty. It's really everybody around him that's encouraging that behavior. So it's really helpful to be able to use this and to explain why the services you think they need in transition or the placement are so important to avoid this ongoing incarceration kind of system in the household.
Absolutely. It's a good point. So this is a genogram, which is just a fancy word for, I've really gotten away from that, a family tree. This is a pretty small one, but what was important in this one, and Jamie's our identified client, was Jamie was born male and was a transgender female. She came to me when she was pretty young, I think only, 16. And this was helpful just to sort of show, yeah, she has all this family, but nobody felt like hers. And very few people felt like their most supportive self to her. And I think through this and exploring who the parents were, who step parents were, who step and half siblings were in the family, we were really able to, and she could certainly, articulate this, but this was helpful just to show. I feel like it was Patricia. It was a step parent who I felt and Jamie felt had her best interests at heart and truly cared about her and accepted her as she was. And this didn't even have anything to do with her legal issues, but just moving forward, it helped us identify the adult of many who probably could be the most helpful for Jamie moving forward and getting out of the system. I kind of can't remember, but that was important. And certainly these can be very involved. I personally like it because some of my child clients have so many family, and just because you're not blood related doesn't mean I can't add you in there and figure out who is important to your life. And it just helps me keep track. And I think it's kind of fun to draw it out too and see who was there and maybe why we don't talk to this person anymore and why this person's become important. So it can be a powerful tool with the clients, certainly for us as social workers and beyond. Next slide, please.
It's also useful to show that your clients have empathy, because so often the POs and the prosecutors are like, they have no remorse, they have no empathy. And when you start drawing out the family tree and talking about who's important to them in their lives, there's a whole lot of empathy there, a whole lot of emotion there, a whole lot of feeling of love and respect and everything that judges and prosecutors think children don't have who are in the criminal justice system. So I like using family trees to help them talk about who's important to them and why, and what that means to them.
And that's an excellent point, Simi. Thanks for bringing it up, because I also find that younger siblings or cousins, neighborhood children are also very important to our clients. And to show, I can't show a picture of that child in my report, but I can certainly draw a picture like this to encapsulate, that empathy and that love and that support that's mutual there. Okay, now
Okay, I'm just gonna make one comment. This is probably my most requested visual aid from attorneys. I love to highlight different themes or family dynamics, such as arrest history. You can, if you do a big extended family tree, you can show things like substance use, domestic violence, gang ties, kind of things that you're trying to develop. It can be an excellent visual aid, especially if you want to talk about how your client was maybe predisposed to a substance use issue. Well, look at the family tree. You can show other things like health issues, mental health concerns. I don't have a software like this. This looks very nice and clean. I usually just kind of draw it out, but I'll make my own designs of how to kind of differentiate what certain things mean. But this is an awesome tool for your team, either the attorney or investigator, or a creative thing you can put into a report. I've seen some. I think people can also make them on like PowerPoint and things like that, but you can really have fun with this. And as a visual person, I love this aid, and it's fun to do with your clients too. If they're artistic, you can get kind of creative with it.
And honestly, I don't think there are any good programs. I find just doing it landscape Word or PowerPoint to be the best.
And it can also help you explain behavior. Like if you can develop on the family tree the younger siblings or cousins who are so important to that client that they will do anything to protect them, that helps explain the behavior and acts behind perhaps the charge. So it really helps to get them to talk about why things happened the way they happened.
Yes, absolutely. And this one was effective with Jamie because of Patricia's her most supportive adult. Patricia's not even a blood relative, and she's way over here. So it was very helpful in that regard. Anyway, continuing. So what roles do we play? We play 5 million roles all the time, and it depends on the point of day and who we're talking to. But similar to our duties as social workers, advocacy is certainly right up there. I think a lot of service referral and navigating, assessment goes hand in hand. We are the mitigation specialists in the room, even when there's a expert hired. We still probably are the ones who know our clients the best outside of our client themselves. Certainly talking with the expert is so important, and a member of the team. We research, we do a ton of reentry planning. While I am a therapist in my other role, I always try to be clear with my client that I'm not their therapist, but I certainly am, supporting them clinically, whether that will be a short practice in deep breathing or box breathing or journaling or whatever might be appropriate. I like to bring in some of those therapeutic tools to help my client function and survive what they're going through at the moment that they're with me. I see us as more so than ever a liaison and a consultant, with, again, being an expert in our client and their life, talking with the attorneys and all the professionals and the partners and the providers and the DA and every which way. So we do it all, as you know. We can do the next slide. I'm going to let Simi talk about this one a bit.
As I mentioned before, when I was talking about Clarence Darrow in 1924, basically social work and the understanding of who the child is has been part of the criminal justice system since 1924. And in that case, the result was the two, Leopold and Loeb, were not given the death penalty. The judge gave them life without parole And he said, for one reason, because of their youth. And so that's why, as a team in the holistic defense, what we're doing is we are really raising the flag of youth. And now we have so much more after Roper and Graham and Miller recognizing the brain science. That's what's been added now since the 80s, 90s, and up until now, is the good brain science that reaffirms what all parents and everybody knows about youth. They're impulsive. They can't foresee the consequences or the worst thing that can happen by engaging in some kind of behavior. And they're very peer driven. And we all know that. We all see it with teenagers, but now it's scientific. And there's all of these cases are really worth reading as social workers because the language is beautiful. Starting with Roper, some of the language is even a heinous crime committed by a youth is not as heinous as that committed by an adult, right there. So you think, well, then how can we treat them the same? And yet we still do, the courts still do. So it's the job of the team, the holistic team of social worker, attorney, experts, to really move that judge off that belief that a child who does a certain act is as responsible as an adult who does that act. And there's so much that we have available to us now to really flood the courts with, to show them that they are not right. And it's not only these cases, but also there'll be another slide. But I'll just mention some of the things now is the research of Abigail Baird. And I don't know if you've looked her up. She was one of the original people who did the functional MRIs with teenagers. And her stuff is incredible. She's at Vassar, and she's now saying, I don't think guys are really gelled, maybe till their late 20s or 30s. Yeah, girls get mature faster, but so she's still doing the research. And one of my favorite parts about her research is when she put an adult in a functional MRI tube and a teenager. And the teenager she uses for her research are her control group are kids that don't have what most of our clients have: trauma, disabilities, and enhanced immaturity because of the trauma. And so these are normal kids, supposedly, who don't have all the excess issues and risks that our clients have in their wagons. And so she'll put them in the functional MRI and ask a simple question: is it smart to eat shards of glass? The adult brain lights up right away. No. The teenage brain, you're just waiting, waiting, waiting. And you say, well, what's going on? And she says, nothing. Because the wiring is such in a teenage brain that the no, the idea, no, it's not a good idea, has to go through all that circuitry before what the brain maturation is. That's how the frontal lobe needs to mature. And that's why it's the last thing to mature. And it's the thing that controls decision-making, judgment, and all of those things that a judge wants to imply you have already when you make a bad decision as a teenager. She also has a great video of a group of young girls and asks, is it a good idea to swim with sharks? And they sit there for a while, and then one girl pipes up and says, well, if Phoebe would, I would. And that is such a great example of the whole thing with peers. Like, what they won't do alone, they will do if a Phoebe is there to do it with them. And it's a great some great video to share with courts, to educate judges. And that's what social workers do. They educate judges right along with the attorney. And so I really love Abigail Baird's stuff. And she is online. You can get all of these things. And
you want to go to the next slide? I kind of start listing them. There we go.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
And then The Galt Center used to be the National Juvenile Defender Center, and it's now called the Galt Center. It's in DC. It has a resource page that is unbeatable. You can find any kind of thing you want to use there to help you represent youth and children. It's spectacular. Experts, research, everything. The Hayward Burns Institute is in San Francisco, and it was developed to do the research on disproportionality and how children of color are overrepresented in our juvenile justice systems. And so they have one of their most recent research pieces is on how kids of color are overprobated and how damaging that is to kids, youth of color. And so I highly recommend that. And then my favorite article on the teenage brain is from the National Geographic in 2011. And it talks about how we are the only species that keep our children in the nest for 18 years. Birds fledge at a few weeks or a month. Deer are born and they get up, and horses, and walk. We keep our kids on the couch for 18 years. So they need the peers to get them out of the house. They need that risk-taking behavior without any forethought. They need to not be able to foresee the consequences of their crazy risk-taking acts. They need to be those risk takers to get them out of the nest. Human beings would not go on. Our species would not move forward if teenagers weren't risk takers, peer driven, and foresaw the consequences of their actions. So we really owe it to teenagers to be crazy if we want to continue on as a species. And it's just a really great article about how they look at that way. And that's also why the teenage body is the most perfect body, because it has to be resilient for all of the risk-taking that it endures. So I really recommend all of these things, and Marty Baer's matrix, where she looks at the immaturity, disability, and trauma, and how that weaves its way through every part of a juvenile case. And I always work with Marty, and we always use that matrix to explain all the decision stages of our child client when they are involved in the criminal justice system. And everything else is also spectacular on that list.
Yeah, I tried to include some books that, I mean, you can get them used that are so invaluable that I'm sure people are already using, but anything Dr. Steinberg writes about is so valuable in terms of brain development in adolescence. I think I bought a used copy of his textbook, and I quote from it every report, same with his Age of Opportunity. And he is one who's constantly doing research and putting work out. He will email you back too. I didn't want to put his email on here because I don't have permission, but if you look for him and have a specific question about his research, he'll actually get back to you, which is amazing. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, I'm sure everybody's read The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't, get it. It helps understand how even when you think you've moved past something, your body holds it tight. And especially for children, it's even hard for them to conceptualize how much is in their body, but they feel it and they know it. And it can be a very powerful tool in talking with them about it. And it can be very powerful to explain for those who need to know more. I'm trying to see what else is in here. I think, Molly, you had that last one. I can't see it, but it's important.
Oh, yeah. The last two were just websites that I like and reference a lot, either in reports, or they also have like printouts you can give to youth or their families. The Harvard University website has a lot on like healthy development, and they also have some great information on like prenatal development, toxic stress. Just if you're, really trying to kind of dig deep into a youth's development, or like especially that really critical early childhood time. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, they have great digestible research. I will just copy and paste some of their research and cite it in my reports, but they break down different types of trauma. They break down, like, for example, if you experienced neighborhood violence in 0 to 6, they'll break it down like the impact or potential impact with different life stages. And so that can be a great website if you need some research to back up or contextualize like a youth's experience or a family's experience in a specific developmental stage. And also they talk about risk factors and resiliency and things like that. So just two additional resources.
That's great.
Excellent. So why do we do this? Brian Stevenson's another hero of mine, as I'm sure he is for many others. He said, each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And I don't know what person can't relate to that. A lot of our child clients, we are meeting them after the worst thing they've ever done. And I use air quotes because I don't know who of us, and I'm not going to call anybody out, who of us, even the people and professionals we're interacting with couldn't have been arrested for something in their youth, who are lucky to be here after a car accident, who are lucky to be here after making some really bad choices, and who are lucky to not have been arrested and put in jail. I'm very aware of my white lady, white girl privilege growing up and some of the things that, quite frankly, a lot of teens get away with, as Simi mentioned earlier. But I think it's really normalizing to hear this and understand this and move forward with it. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to always revisit the why. Next slide. So how do we do this? And I think it's important to have policies written in each agency. The federal guidelines for this marriage of, attorney and social worker is important to know, followed by the state guidelines, because still to this day, each state's a little bit different when it comes to their mandatory reporting, and then leading up to the agency guidelines of what your attorney teams and your bosses and supervisors expect from you as a criminal defense-based forensic social worker. And quite frankly, it's not for all social workers, and that's okay. So I think it's just important to sort of visit your trickle down there. Next slide, please. Go for it, Molly.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the specific skills that I at least did not learn while I was in school, and I don't think they teach this really, but this is requesting records. And I wanted to kind of throw out a question, if you guys will indulge me, about whether that's something your attorneys ask you for. I know in my office, it's kind of a tricky subject, but is often divided. And so I'm aware people may have different policies, but just curious if either of you are asked to do this with your teams.
Yes, for me, yes, this is something that almost every single attorney requests, whether it be for trial or a diversion. It seems like it's every attorney that requests records. And I'm in agreement with you, no, school did not teach us this. So there was a lot of navigating this for ourselves, and people in the community seem to have a hard time understanding and grasping the concept of who we are, why we need these records. And so there is a lot of back and forth that goes on, and sometimes having to go with families to go get these records, or having, to CC the attorneys in some of these emails, because facilities can make it difficult to access some of these records.
Okay, that's helpful. Yes, well, so I just put a couple notes up here. So it can be very tedious, especially if you're getting pushback, or you have to go with a family, or ask an attorney to do like a subpoena. That's something we have to do sometimes. There are some medical facilities that give us a really hard time, but records are just an integral part of mitigation work. Especially when you're looking at a youth looking at a lot of time, like a decline or an auto decline. And so I'm just wanted to go over like a couple ways that they can be used. So of course, if the attorney asks to support something regarding trial or probation allegation or something like that, they can be really, really important. But also in developing your mitigation, I try time dependent, but I try to throw out a comprehensive net that I'll go over in a second of some kind of common places. But records can also be used as visual aids in reports. So if I am able to get like child welfare reports, sometimes I'll do like a little screenshot. I quote them quite a bit. We talked about timelines, but that can be like these can be really helpful in aiding your timelines as far as like getting specific dates, or if you have a youth with a long foster care history, for example, I've done like a table where I write out all their different placements or different things like that can really just be like an extra visual aid and also corroborate like your client's story. And then also if you are working with an expert, they typically require these. So it was a big learning curve for me. And also it seems a little bit like a moving target sometimes because places will change their form, for example, or maybe their contact person you've had leaves. But it's important to do, especially if you can get started on it right when you get a new case or a new referral. And this is nowhere near an exhaustive list, but some of the really important ones to consider. I don't do this on every case, but if I do have rapport with the mom in particular, I do like to get birth records that can just be really telling regarding your client's first, year or so of life, or if there are any prenatal concerns. These do require the mom's signature. So the birth records are technically owned by the mother. So it does take a little work with getting that signature, but those can be invaluable. And a lot of times experts will like to see those. And then medical. So I like to get the pediatrician records. Of course, if there have been any psychiatric hospitalizations or emergency rooms, I try to get creative with how I ask these questions because sometimes young people either won't remember but sometimes I'll even ask, like, have you ever been in an ambulance? And like that will kind of spur a memory. Child welfare, which I'll go into more detail in a moment. Education, super important, especially if there's any type of special education history, even in the past. I have caught some really wild things, like a young person moving from one school district from the other, and the receiving district never got the IEP. And so a youth went months without services, but also just kind of understanding, especially if there are any learning differences or ways in communication that are different that you can kind of educate the attorney on. Super duper important. Department of Developmental Disabilities, State Children's Hospital. So CSTC, that is the Child Study and Treatment Center. That is the youth psychiatric hospital that sometimes very, very, very acute and high level. So it's not often, but those are very important. Any mental health records, and then of course, anything juvenile justice related. So we try to get the youth detention records and then also juvenile probation. Probation has pushed back a lot with the records they will give us. And so that is another one that sometimes will have to be subpoenaed by the attorney, especially if you are wanting to kind of get something like the probation officer's notes, or ours use of a program called like crons where they enter kind of their notes, but those can be really, really important to get if there's any like allegation that they either weren't following the rules, or they weren't successful on probation. If you can kind of try to understand like how often the probation officer is reaching out or what they're actually doing. If the probation, at least where I work, can often be big gatekeepers of services. And so whether they were making referrals, things like that, it can be really important. But many times, I know we get a variety of cases, so sometimes I don't have time to get any of these records, or maybe I'll just ask for the most recent IEP versus like every IEP from kindergarten forward. So, using kind of your time, the goals of the case, keeping those things in mind. But if you do have time, these are some really good places to start, and oftentimes will lead to more records depending again on kind of the goals of the case. And then I just wanted to share like 2 little tricks that I've learned along the way. So the Healthcare Authority for Washington State, this is a great one. They have their own release of information form that I can share. But if your client can't remember, or maybe was in foster care and just moved around a lot, so during your interview and you're asking them, oh, where have you been for counseling? They say, oh, I've been somewhere, but I can't remember, or I think it was in Tacoma. You can request what's called their healthcare ledger through the Healthcare Authority, and that will give you a sheet of every place their Medicaid was billed. And so again, if you're really trying to go get really deep and get an exhaustive records list with them, that can be super helpful. And then the last one I wanted to talk about briefly is the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So as we know, that's any child welfare contacts, but also our juvenile rehabilitation system. These are excruciatingly difficult and slow to get. I know I get quoted, I think it's 180 business days from date of request. And so that usually is about 6 to 9 months. And they also have some requirements that can be kind of annoying. So one of them is that they usually write back and say, we need a copy of the client's ID. That is not always available, especially if your client is incarcerated. And so there are a couple ways around that. You can have the attorney, or you can help the attorney write a letter of representation. So that's just a really brief form saying, this is who I am. We represent this client in a legal matter. And then we attach the notice of appearance and send that to DCYF in lieu of an ID. You can also write a declaration if you have access to a notary and say, my name is Molly Hennessey. I am a social worker. I work in this capacity. I witnessed Jane Doe signed this release of information, and I attest that that's true and accurate, and they have someone notarize that. So those are 2 ways I've been able to get around the ID issue. My 2 other tips were that to try to be as specific as possible. So if you don't necessarily need the whole file, but you are looking at for just referrals, or you're looking at if some kind of referral plus the investigation notes, as much as you can narrow it, the better. The same goes for juvenile rehabilitation. For example, I found some of the notes about the groups they do aren't necessarily as important, because it's a lot of heavily redacted information. It includes other use information. And so sometimes I'll ask for those to be left out. But kind of, again, taking into consideration your case and what the needs are. And the last trick, this is something someone at DCYF actually clued me in on, but you can ask for what's called a prior involvement report. And it's often not maybe less than 50 pages, depending on your client's history, but this will give you an overview of their involvement and investigations. It won't give you any type of notes or anything regarding their investigation, but it will give kind of the general referral and like maybe like the follow-up. And it usually will tell you if it's founded or unfounded. But sometimes I'll use this just to get an idea of like how often there's been contact, or if there was an allegation, like getting kind of the exact like language to really understand what the referent saw or things like that. And again, those take usually a couple weeks to get, I would say maybe up to a month, but in a time crunch scenario can be better than nothing, I guess, because sometimes I'll have a case like resolve and then I get a letter from DCYF or their first installment of records and I'm like, oh yeah, too little too late, I forgot to cancel it. So
Thank you, Molly. That's so important to know the ins and outs. And it's like, seems like every county is different here almost. So that's nice. There's some centralization. One thing I try to keep in mind when meeting with my client and trying to explain how I'm going to tell their story and how I'm going to do mitigation is really that I approach it from a past, present, future, and that I'm asking all these questions about what happened before that has seemingly nothing to do with your current charges, because it has everything to do with how we got to this point. Kind of what's going on now, where they're at, what's helping, what's not helping, what's problematic, what the struggles are, and how are we going to move forward. So I think reminding myself and the client that's what I'm doing is always beneficial. Certainly this takes team collaboration, involving experts when needed. Cultural humility for me, as a white woman, is very important, that I'm trying to always incorporate partners and partner with other professionals of color to help my client best, and always going to those trainings because there's always more for me to learn so I can best serve my clients. And really, we're going to get into this a second, knowing that there's always going to be barriers, and what's difficult in a barrier is really case by case, and some things repeat themselves, but really paying attention to that. I'm a very direct person with my clients and with the attorneys. And so if there is a big or small elephant in the room, I feel like it's my job to bring it up so we can move forward and work with it or around it, through it, whatever that may be. How's everybody doing? Does anybody feel like they need a bathroom or water break, or should we full steam ahead? I'm good to go forward. So next slide. Okay, this is one of my favorite things to get into, talk about barriers and making people uncomfortable. I love to talk about ethical conflicts and issues. Overall, because attorneys and social workers and family culture and culture and where we live and where we practice in academia versus, the real world, it is important to know that things will happen. But that's not to shy away from. But I think if none of us are naive enough to think that things aren't going to come up with this attorney social work sort of professional marriage. So knowing that they will happen is sort of the first step. What I find to be the most helpful is knowing and developing a plan or protocol for each one, which we're going to go through in detail coming up. I'm going to be speaking from what I have found to be most helpful and from what I have done on teams, but that's certainly not the only way. It's just to give you ideas and examples of how to tackle things. But I think very most important is when you first are on a team with your attorney and the client, is to really have a conversation about expectations. That you're not going way back to that slide of like what people think social workers do. Really explaining that you're partnering with the attorney for the best legal outcome. That's not to say that you're going to ignore if a client is really struggling with something and considering self-harm, that you're not going to address it, but you're not running to the police to report something. And really sitting down and discussing, how we are going to attack things if and when they come up. And the truth is they don't come up on every case, and they don't even come up that often, but they do come up. Outside of meeting with the attorney team, there's always consultation, whether that's mentors, really any one of us I would be fine with if there's not, mutual clients and co-defendants involved, the people you work for, peer review, which I know we do all the time, is the consultation piece. So let's get into the individual ethical conflicts that could potentially come up. One thing that like I mentioned, I found works for myself on the attorney teams that I work with is I always meet the client first and foremost with the attorney. I like the attorney to introduce me, because one of the first things that an attorney rightfully tells a client is do not talk to anybody else about your case, only talk to me. So they need to know visually in front of their face that I am actually just an arm of the attorney, and that I'm included in that same client attorney privilege, and they can talk to me. This is my way, really, for both the attorneys and the client, for me to explain all my roles and duties and what we might be working on, and answer any questions, because I think the majority of our clients have overlapped somehow with, whether it be social workers at schools, counselors, they've been in some sort of trouble before. How am I different, and how am I on their legal defense team? So really talking about it at the onset. This would be up to whichever agency is reviewing this recording, but I always recommend putting expectations in writing so that when things do come up, it can be revisited. Supervision, whether it be you're still getting your license and you're supervised by a clinical person or the office head or just the attorney on the team, supervision is always important. There's usually, even as a social worker, I've been doing this for 20 years, I still have group supervision that I like to go to once a month, really, because things come up and it's nice to bounce ideas and concerns and just human nature feelings about it all with my peers and other professionals. And this is where I know a lot of peer review happens in Washington and the tri-counties, talking to each other with respect to the same, the client attorney privilege that I know everybody is aware of, but really it is so helpful. It could be as simple as, I'm just so sad for the world sometimes. And some clients and cases really get you. And I just need somebody else to know this. And for me to tell them I'm sad, all the way up to logistics of like, how are we going to work around this? And what are your ideas? So I know everybody does that. So we'll do the next slide and talk some more. And again, well, these are what I say common ethical dilemmas. I don't deal with them all the time. So I don't want to scare anybody in thinking that I'm like worried about this all the time. I just like to think it out. So if and when it happens, I have some sort of map in my brain of how I'm going to tackle it. But I will say I have encountered each of these issues in the 20 years that I've been doing it. I think, and I'm going to start with some examples. And if anybody, we'll get to a chance of if there's any you want to workshop, and Simi and Molly are also going to give some of their examples, so you don't get tired of hearing me talk. But harm to self is probably the most common one that we deal with, working with child clients and youth. Unfortunately, I think, like we've said, we're meeting them at one of the hardest points in their life. And self-harm is sometimes a coping mechanism, not that I would ever recommend, but certainly one that teens turn to. My biggest example lately, and I did workshop this a little bit with Simi and Molly, I have a very young client who's 13 who has been a cutter for probably the past year. She finds it, unfortunately, it is her go-to coping skill sometimes. And one thing that came up this past week in talking with her, her mom's the alleged victim. So it's tricky for me because I can't approach mom with these things. I had been on the phone meeting with my client and really heard mom saying some very abusive, emotionally abusive things towards my client, her daughter. I also learned of the fact that she had you self-harmed the day before. And so all of my adrenaline's going and all of my worries and concerns are going very large. What ended up happening is not so relevant, as I really, talked with the attorney about this. I'm not going to report it to mom, but I need to make sure my client is okay. So I hung up with she assured me that she wasn't going to do anything right then. She didn't have suicidal ideations. She was using cutting as a form of relief. And so I said, I really want to help you on this. What if, maybe this is a weekend to go to aunt and uncle's, which she doesn't always want to do, but it does sort of help bring down the temperature in the home and give a little bit of respite care for everybody involved. So she did promise me she could, go to a room and listen to music and use some other coping skills to calm down until I talked to the attorney and we called back. In this case, I did involve the GAL because that person's more able to talk with the family and sort of brainstorm next steps. But unfortunately, that one does come up quite a bit. Harm to others. Molly, did you have one on this?
So we did talk about this. One of my examples that came is clients maybe making like indirect statements about wanting to beat up their attorney or something like that. That one has come up quite a medium amount, I would say. And so, with confidentiality, you are allowed to tell the attorney. And so, of course, I always pass on that comment to the attorney and kind of let them decide how they want to keep themselves safe. Thankfully, a lot of times I think it can be blowing off steam, but of course that's not my role to judge the credibility of that. And so that is something that I've definitely have talked to the attorney about, or I guess less common, but for youth in detention, maybe making a comment about one of the officers at detention or another youth. And so usually if it's something like that, we can kind of talk that through and talk about coping skills, or even just being like, hey, is that really a good choice to make right now? But always going back to the attorney about that.
That's a good one. And I think child abuse is certainly one that comes up a little bit, maybe as often as harm to self, in the sense of maybe somebody's worried about their sibling or cousin, or something has happened in the past. I find when I investigate a little further, it has been reported, or I don't know what, I've had a lot of young clients lately. Another 12-year-old that did tell me about something that happened at home. Well, this 12-year-old also has a GAL and also has a caseworker for DHS because of a myriad of reasons. And while it's not really appropriate for me to report that, I did encourage this client to say, well, how would you feel about if we called, your caseworker? And is this something you would feel comfortable or like a good choice to talk to this person? So it's not me reporting it. I'm not breaking any confidences, but I also want to make sure that my child client is safe. And ultimately, there's always somebody else who has eyes on this child who's better suited to look out for the safety of this child. So that's the route I've kind of gone. And then I do tell my clients straight up, even when they're young, I am going to tell the attorney about this because we care about you as our client and we want you to be safe. So I feel like there's always, a way to work with the professionals who are on the case to make sure our client is safe and to let the attorney know what's going on. Triangulation, I almost find this one funny because it's so obvious when it's happening, and it does happen quite a bit. I would say not so much with my younger clients, but some of my 20-something-year-old clients who think they might be really savvy. And I very well know, say Simi and I have the same client. If they're telling me what a terrible job Simi's doing, but I really get them and I'm really doing the best job, I know they're blowing smoke up my you know what, and they're doing the exact same thing with Simi and telling them what a terrible job I'm doing, but you're the one who's doing it. It just breaks down the defense, I guess, quality in terms of really helping our clients. So if and when that happens, I try to bring, call another team meeting so we're all in the same space and talking about goals and what we need to do next. Manipulation and unprofessionalism. Did somebody else have a example of this, or do you want me to share?
You can keep going.
Okay. I get tired of hearing myself talk. This is not one that is like a no, I'm going to tattletale on you. I find I have certain boundaries with my client. Well, the manipulation, unprofessionalism, and sexual misconduct can all go hand in hand, and that I try to have very, very clear boundaries because I'm not the attorney. I'm not the lead of the team. And I find that attorneys can do and are fine with certain things that I'm just not, and that's okay. I've been asked to maybe I never touch a client, I never hug a client. That's a boundary that is important to me. But I have worked with attorneys that might hug a client or give a warm, shoulder hold. That while I wouldn't do it, I didn't find it to be inappropriate or the wrong choice. However, there have been times more with my male attorneys that if they don't have a deeper understanding of trauma and trauma response, and again, I'm not the boss of them, but I can really encourage you to don't touch that woman's shoulder, and don't stand behind her. And there's too much in her history that we need to be really mindful that we're more than a handshake, which might even not be the best either. I do a lot of fist bumps. We're not going to do that. I would recommend we not do that on the case. And ultimately, it's up to the attorney to take it or leave it. But I've seen both happen where I do have my immature response of like, well, I told you so, but where do we go from here? It just comes up. And I just bring it up. I think it is also manipulation, and the client's free will can sometimes go hand in hand. My prior young lady client that I was talking about, while I see a respite care as being a positive thing for my client, there's times that I suggest that and she does not want to do that. And it's not my place to push it on her. All I can do is try to be as supportive as possible, but it doesn't always happen. And we'll leave it at that. Can somebody else share maybe a little bit about the sexual misconduct and the professionalism?
Sure, I can. I think over the course of the 10 years, I've had kind of a range of things that have come up working with youth. Different examples of either being inappropriate with their communication, like sending a winky face in a text or things like that, all the way to more like overt inappropriateness, sexual misconduct. So, it was something in my earlier years, I would say, that I struggled with more, getting comfortable with my own professional boundaries, my own voice as a clinician, or social worker. And, also I think what Maren had just said was that, other professionals and colleagues may have different boundaries than you. But it's important to get really firm in your boundaries, especially around sexual misconduct, because I think there were times in my earlier years that I maybe internalized when things would happen, or when clients pushed against my boundaries or ran right over them in some cases, to where, I was kind of wondering, oh, did I invite that? Or was there something that I should have been more direct about? And so that's where I think supervision, if you have access to it, and also working with the attorneys, is so important. And then also your own kind of self-care, whatever that may be. But Yeah, I've had clients either like flash me in some of the correctional areas, which is really hard because a couple of times I've ended the visit immediately and the officers are kind of like, what happened? And I'm just like, oh, gotta go. I'm not going to report it to them, but my first call is going to be to the attorney or my supervisor. And so just little things over the years that I've picked up, like I know a lot of teenage boys will rest with their hands in the waistband of their pants, and that's fine. They're not being inappropriate, but a boundary of mine is just to have hands on the table and things like that. And I'm comfortable kind of stating that ahead of time at the visit or redirecting them if they forget. But also there have been some scenarios where I've said, I think my work is done with this client if they have been inappropriate. Really the only times have been sexual inappropriateness that I've told an attorney, I'm just not really comfortable continuing. If you do have male colleagues in the office, like that can be helpful to maybe suggest that, or just saying, I can support from behind the scenes. But my contact with the client, needs to cease because really, obviously your own personal longevity and resilience is really, really important. But also we don't want to set the client up for getting in trouble if, things are happening like in a detention facility or they're triggered or escalating behavior with you because that could, put them in jeopardy also. But really thinking about putting ourselves first as if we want to continue doing this, I think really getting firm in your boundaries, whatever those may be, is super important.
Thanks. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to talk about free will because that is another one that I think comes up a lot in this role that can kind of clash maybe with our like social work values. But as defense-based workers, we have to follow stated interest instead of best interest, and that's something that I internally struggle with. And I talk to my colleagues, talk to my supervisor a lot, but especially in juvenile court, I think when we're doing like release planning or talking to them about placement somewhere, or maybe going to a substance use facility and they're like, oh, I just want to get out, and then I might take off. Like they may make an offhanded comment to you, and internally you're like, no, that's going to be so much worse. But following kind of what their stated interest is, and then doing as much harm reduction and, front loading them with services that will hopefully help them wherever they may be, but letting them exercise their free will, make decisions about where they want to be. Also having thoughtful conversations with them maybe too, but I think the free will piece is one that is constant struggle. And I had given an example the other day where I had a young lady client that had a history of being a victim of child sex trafficking. And we were looking at releasing her to a youth shelter. And I felt internally very uncomfortable with that. But obviously, she could not remain in detention. Detention is a horrible, traumatic place for her to be. But internally, it felt a little tricky releasing her to a place without a ton of supervision. But that's what we did. And that was what she wanted, of course. So that one comes up for me quite a bit and is something that I'm constantly working on and communicating with others about.
And one thing you just said, Molly, thanks for being so vulnerable and sharing some of those stories that made me think of something else with harm to self. There have been clients that I might have been worried they had an item to harm themselves or even, attempt suicide with. that while, like you said, with the guard, I'm not going to go out and tell the guard right away, but I am in a safety plan with that client while I'm in front of them about, how serious the thoughts are and the ideas are and the potential plan is. And I'm not going to leave them until I have a plan with them of me going, and I'm going to go talk to our team. And maybe this client is particularly close to the investigator and they're going to come for a visit tonight. And then I'm going to call you in the morning. And it's not that I report to the detention center, but in a sense, I'm reporting to the team with the client at the table and safety planning with that client to make sure that they're safe. Another thing with sexual misconduct, sort of a follow-up of boundaries and guidelines. Unfortunately, we're all women on this Zoom, and if it hasn't happened already, unfortunately, it will probably happen in our careers. And I think I blocked it out. It's not funny, but it was kind of funny. I had a client who, because he knew what his diagnosis was and because he was aware of all the trauma in his history and that he has borderline personality disorder, towards the end of our work, he really used sort of sexual misconduct as a way to sabotage a bit because our work was ending, and sent me some inappropriate letters that I think he almost did it because of some of his issues with boundaries, and he didn't want it to end. And it's not that I thought, while he shouldn't have written some of the inappropriate things, it's not that he loved me, it's just I was nice to him. And so, and I'm not saying everybody has to do this, but it was an opportunity with the attorney to go back and talk to him about, one, why this was inappropriate. And what I notice is that this is really, we've been in your corner for, it was a long case, 2 years, and now we're about to leave. And it was sort of a misguided last ditch effort to, hold on to us. But it was also a teachable opportunity of, he unfortunately did not have some healthy professional relationships with other women. And it was a way, although it was very hard and I didn't want to do it, I felt better doing this with the attorney present and really talking about sort of why do we lead to this and why it's not appropriate, and that we can still kind of end this professional relationship in an appropriate way. What does it say under clients free will? I can't see that.
Involving the
Involving
media.
media.
Oh, I don't know if anybody's had to deal with this. I shared with the ladies the other day, and I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere. I have a straight, like, I'm not doing it. I'm not talking to you. I default to the attorney. Again, it's up to the attorney. Occasionally it comes up that I really rely heavily on the attorney it's up to the clients, and this is a free will thing too. I don't think it's good for clients and their families to talk to the media, but it certainly happens. And so it's just been a strange thing to go into court and see somebody there that I have to really say, oh, no comment, or, not confirm or deny anything.
I have not had much experience with the media, but going back to clients' free will, I just wanted to say something little about that was, whenever it comes to what the client needs, I really do try to step outside of the expert role and understand them from their perspective and take their experiences into consideration and try to understand why it is that they're making the decisions that they're making for themselves. And I try to be very transparent. I hope by the time that we get there to where they're able to start making decisions for, let's say, release, for example, I hope we've built enough rapport within our relationship that I can give them my honest opinion of, this is why I think this is what you think. Let's get this on paper and let's see it together in a visual of, what do we think the effects are going to be of this, for both sides? And then I want you to just, and I always try and end with, I just want you to make the best decision for yourself. And I want you to be as informed as you possibly can be on the decision that you will be making for you. So I really try to be transparent in that.
So when you do the visual, do you draw, like, when you make this decision, these are the outcomes, this decision, this might be the outcome, and talk about that together?
Yeah, like I'll try to do it on the whiteboard. For example, if we're in detention, or if it's a client in their home, I'll bring a whiteboard with me, and then we'll write their decision, and then the one, the attorneys want, or something that in that
Right.
way, and then right under we'll start, okay, so what can happen if we make this decision that you want? And we'll start kind of
Right.
brainstorming together. And then we look at the pros and cons and we think, okay, so what are we thinking now? Where is your head after seeing this visually?
Fantastic.
Yeah, but with the media, I don't have much experience with that. What I feel is a little similar to that maybe is when where I'm at, it's a very small area, very rural. And so a lot of the alleged victims' families come to court,
Mm.
and they'll kind of be live streaming it outside the courtroom, or they try to intimidate my client's family. And so understanding that they're going through something very difficult. And I try to tell my client, because they're very close to their family most times, and they get very upset and they say, well, if they say something to my family while I'm up there, I'm going to react. And I say, try to redirect and encourage them. You focus on you. I will be back there with your family, and I will be your eyes and ears, and I will stick up for your family back there. I will advocate for them, and giving the family the support that they need. I had a mom that she was just very intimidated by the family. It was just her, and there was about 30 of the alleged victims' family members there. And so talking to the attorney, talking to the investigator, getting the entire team there together to show the support we had for her, and letting her know you're not alone in this. Like, we're here with you every step of the way. I'll sit right next to you through all of it, walk you to and from your car, and just trying to be as supportive as I could be within my ethical boundaries. And so I think that trying to navigate that, along with trying to navigate being in rural areas, where kind of everybody knows everybody and everyone knows what cases you're on, unfortunately, just because of when they see you. Just trying to remain professional, keeping my badge on at all times so they could see I'm working, and trying just to stay neutral, but at the same time supporting my families.
Great points.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And this was a unique story. I think a lot of this is also just thinking outside the box, getting creative. I had a client, and this just floored me, but I was not the best person to speak to him about this, even though I could imagine what he was talking about. I had a young client who was also quite physically small, who they wanted to put in DOC. They wanted to give my client a adult sentence, serve time in DOC. And I had so many worries. It's just so much, as a mom, as knowing him for a year, he's a teenager. He thinks he's bigger and better than the world perceives him. And I just couldn't understand at first why he would want this. But then as we dug a little deeper about the family culture and some of the gang involvement, he had a very false belief that it would be easier time, that if he went to DOC, he has an uncle who's higher up in the gang, and he had a very false belief that, one, he was going to be placed anywhere near the uncle, and two, that this uncle was actually going to be able to control so much of the different gang culture in the prison that he was going to be safe there. And he was going to watch TV and be able to knock off his 2 years versus 4 years at YOS. Now, I'm not, like you said earlier, I'm not going to make the decision for him or manipulate him in a certain way of what I think is best. I've never stepped a day in his shoes, and that's not going to happen. But I was with him, we were thinking and thinking, because we just had so many concerns over this as to the why, that I was able to find. It was a young woman, but her brother had also served time and ended up getting killed in DOC. And she was a young teenager who served time in an adult prison. And I needed her to come with me to talk to him, to actually balance out that pros and cons list of taking an adult offer versus a YOS offer, which both are hard. But I'm way more, as a professional, concerned about one and the other. But I'm not the best person to talk to him about this. And so it was better to have her really, talk about the reality of what prison looks like and what happened to her brother and what happened for her, for him to make his best informed decision. And that was a tough one for me, because I couldn't understand why in the hell you would want to go to prison. I just, but it's not for me to understand, but it is for me to help find the information for him to understand. So,
And for everyone else, YOS, our equivalent would be Green Hill School.
yes, sorry.
So youth treatment focused, more involved time versus DOC.
Hard
Education.
for sure, but different. Yeah. Next slide, please. Does anybody have, oh, well, yeah, we're going into questions. Does anybody have any questions or case examples they want to work through with our remaining time together?
I think one important thing to point out as well is that sometimes there's not a match to the families we receive, to the youth, and recognizing that as clinician and social worker and thinking to yourself, well, how can I better serve this client? And realizing it's not personal for us, right? It's never personal. I think there was only one instance where I realized not so much with the youth, but the family was very involved and there wasn't much of a match with me and the family. And I knew Connie, my colleague here, was a much better match than I was, and making the decision of removing myself from the role and referring it out to her because I knew that she would be able to build a much better rapport with a family who was already so involved in the youth, look to for a lot of guidance, and kind of letting her take, control of that situation. I felt the youth would be better served in that situation. So sometimes checking ourselves for our own biases and our own feelings and situations, and really knowing when we bring other service providers in and when it's important to bring them in.
Absolutely. It's awesome to have at least one other person to be able to kind of play off each other's skills and experience and rapport you can build. So it's awesome. We also do that here and there, like when appropriate. So.
Any other questions or last thoughts? Well, from what I know, you both are doing an amazing job. I hope whatever comes next is the best fit ever for you. And you have my email. I'm always here to reach out to and bounce ideas off of. And it's a tough work, but it's well worth it.
Yes, thank you so much. And you guys have all been everyone on the team has been so supportive and willing to assist, even on cases that they're not on, and just bounce ideas off one another.
Thank you all for participating. It's been great.
Yes.
Would you have any words for potential people who are coming into this work? So in the future, if OPD is able to hire a bunch of new folks, I think the idea is that they'll be able to watch this maybe at the start versus, I know you guys are a couple years in. So maybe if you have any words of wisdom or comments, we could record now.
Right. I think for me, like Maren had said, supervision. Supervision is so important. And staffing, while staying within our ethical boundaries and respecting confidentiality, but staffing the cases, talking to your supervisor, especially when it comes to your own biases, sexual misconduct, it is a thing. It does come up. And like you had said, Molly, sometimes you internalize these things, and having somebody to speak to and, just ask those questions of like, did I bring this onto myself? Like, what are your thoughts on this? How can I approach this youth who might not know that they're doing this or that this is inappropriate? And how can I do this without breaking the rapport that we've already built? So I would say supervision is so important. Staffing is very important. Trying your best to maintain a good relationship with attorneys. And I think for me, I'm such an empath, and so sensitive, and just recognizing attorneys can be very black and white. It's not personal. When they say something, it's in the best of the situation, and they're just making the decision that they need to make. And so sometimes I think as therapists and social workers, we'll read into facial expressions, body language, and tone, but realizing that when it comes to attorneys, they really are doing what's best for the client, and just keeping them updated, even when they're not responding, continuing to keep them updated because they are reading those emails. It's just that sometimes they don't respond. They're very busy. They have a high caseload. And trying to fill them in the best you can before they have a meeting, because like I said, they do have a very high caseload, but they want to go in and let the youth know that they care about them, that they have been working on their case. And so some of our notes, just bulletin points on, what the youth has said or the family, so the attorney can just quickly reference and bring up if necessary. And then I would say taking some time to just get to know all of the resources in the area, know that it takes time to build relationships, and just to remain consistent. There are going to be times where, certain community providers or other service providers aren't as willing to work with us, but just remaining consistent in what it is that we do and knowing that we're doing it for a reason and that we're advocating for these youth and that you're doing great work.
Mhm. Very well said. I don't think any of us would be doing this if we weren't a little sensitive and not overly empathetic, but sometimes it's a real hard thing. And please know, especially the young women entering the field, you're never doing anything to invite anything. It's maybe an opportunity for everybody to learn, but you're never doing anything. I've been a supervisor for a long time, and there's, certain male colleagues that I'm like, do boys do this? The answer is almost, you as a female professional did not do anything. Any other questions or thoughts?
For me, I would say as well, like Paula, supervision and staffing, just to learn more of other people's, what they've done, kind of brainstorm on something that you're needing some support with, and also building that rapport with your client, and so that they're able to start trusting you and open up more to the case manager.
And sometimes building the rapport is playing cards together that first time and not looking eye to eye, and some of those logistics of like, what music do you like, and being the uninformed older nice lady that I don't have to know everything, and letting my young client be the expert on whatever is cool now.
Yeah.
I think
yeah, Roblox I learned, or I don't know if I'm even saying it right. Minecraft.
yes. Tell me why it's fun.
Yeah, right. I always try to come from a wondering point of view. Even when I know something, tell me more about that. How does that work? Right. I've noticed, especially my kids in detention, I think more my males than my females are very connected to the arts. Very connected to the arts. And so sometimes rapport building looks like, why don't we draw a music video cover?
Yeah.
And you assign a song to it, and then we'll deconstruct the lyrics, and you'll tell me why that song's your favorite song. And so, yeah, or playing Uno.
Yeah. I love all that, and that they are free to laugh at my drawings because I'm sure all of them are more talented than myself.
And I keep lists, or I did keep lists of words I say that they don't know and words they say that I don't know. And so then they'll stop me and I'll have to write the word and explain it. I'll stop them. They got to explain it. And we just keep running lists of words that trick each other, that we don't get. And it helps me understand their literacy levels in some ways. And it also helps them understand the law and how it affects their case.
Great ideas. I love it. And also take heart that we're going to do a similar training geared towards the attorneys, and it'll be recorded as well. So that will be somewhere in the universe for reference purposes. So thank you so much, everybody, for taking time. As always, I'm only a phone call, an email, or Zoom away. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.